Chapter 5. A Journey Back to the Woods. Christopher Robin stood outside his office building, his mind swirling with the events of the day. It had been so ordinary at first: papers, meetings, responsibilities. But then, something extraordinary had happened. Winnie the Pooh had appeared. His old friend, from the 100-acre wood, had wandered into his grown-up life, bringing with him the simplicity and magic Christopher had almost forgotten. Now, standing on the busy London street, Christopher felt a tug deep in his heart. Pooh had asked for his help to find their friends, to go back to the 100-acre wood. And although a part of him knew that his work was waiting for him, another part, the part that remembered the joy of being a child, was calling him in a different direction. He took a deep breath and looked around at the bustling city. The tall buildings loomed overhead, the cars zoomed past, and the people rushed by, each absorbed in their own busy lives. But in that moment, none of it seemed to matter as much as the thought of returning to the woods. "Right," Christopher whispered to himself, a smile forming on his lips. "It's time for an adventure." Without another thought, Christopher hailed a taxi and climbed in. As the car sped away from the city, Christopher's mind drifted back to his childhood. He thought of Pooh and Piglet, of Tigger and Eeyore. He remembered the smell of the trees, the feel of the soft grass beneath his feet, and the sound of the wind as it whispered through the 100-acre wood. He had been so happy there, so free. And now he was going back. The taxis soon left the noisy city behind, the roads becoming narrower, the landscape greener. Fields stretched out on either side of the road, and the air began to feel fresher, cleaner. The closer they got to the countryside, the lighter Christopher felt, as though he were shedding the weight of his grown-up responsibilities with every mile. When the taxi finally came to a stop, Christopher stepped out onto a familiar dirt path. The entrance to the 100-acre wood stood before him, just as it had all those years ago. The tall trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the forest seemed to welcome him home with open arms. Christopher smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. "I'm back," he whispered, his heart full of both excitement and nostalgia. Just then, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Christopher Robin," Pooh called, waddling up the path toward him, his little belly bouncing with each step. "I knew you'd come." Christopher laughed, kneeling down to hug his old friend. "Of course, Pooh. I promised I would." Pooh beamed up at him. "Now that you're here, we can find the others. I've been quite lost without Piglet and Tigger." Christopher stood up, looking out into the woods. "Then let's go find them, just like old times." And so, the two friends set off into the forest, side by side. As they walked, Christopher couldn't help but notice how little had changed. The trees were as tall and green as he remembered, the air smelled sweet with wildflowers, and the soft sound of the stream bubbling nearby filled his ears like music. "I miss this place," Christopher said quietly. "We missed you too," Pooh replied, his voice soft but full of warmth. As they wandered deeper into the woods, calling out for their friends, the sounds of the 100-acre wood began to surround them, birds singing high in the trees, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional splash of a fish jumping in the stream. It was as though the forest itself was coming to life, ready to welcome Christopher back into its fold. Suddenly, a small, timid voice called out from behind a tree. "Christopher Robin? Is that really you?" Christopher stopped in his tracks, his heart skipping a beat. He turned toward the sound, and there, peeking out from behind a bush, was Piglet. His little pink nose twitched nervously, but his eyes were wide with hope. "Piglet!" Christopher called, rushing over to his tiny friend. Piglet squealed with joy and ran out from behind the bush, throwing his tiny arms around Christopher's leg. "Oh, Christopher Robin! I thought I'd never see you again." Christopher knelt down, smiling warmly. "Of course you'd see me again, Piglet. I'd never forget about you." Piglet looked up at him, his eyes full of gratitude. "But you've been gone so long. I was afraid you might have forgotten us." Christopher shook his head, feeling a lump in his throat. "Never, Piglet. I could never forget any of you." With Piglet now safely by their side, the three friends continued their search. They called out for Tigger and Eeyore as they made their way through the woods, their laughter and voices echoing through the trees. It wasn't long before they heard a familiar bouncing sound, a sound that could only belong to one person. Ho 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 ho! Look who's back in action, a voice shouted, and from behind a tree, Tigger came bouncing into view, his striped tail springing up and down with excitement.
Tigger!
Christopher laughed, watching as Tigger bounced circles around them. Well, if it isn't old Christopher Robin, Tigger exclaimed, landing in front of him with a grin. I knew you'd come back. You can't keep a good Tigger down, you know. Christopher chuckled, shaking his head. I wouldn't dream of it, Tigger. With Tigger now in tow, they set off once more, calling out for Eeyore. As they walked, Christopher felt the lightness of the 100-acre would fill him up. He had forgotten how much joy these simple moments could bring, the laughter, the friendship, the endless possibilities of adventure. At last, they reached a small clearing, and there, standing beside a patch of thistles, was Eeyore. The gloomy donkey glanced up as they approached, his ears drooping as usual. Well, look who decided to come back, Eeyore said in his slow, familiar voice. Didn't think I'd see you again, Christopher Robin. Figured you'd forgotten about us. Christopher smiled, walking over to pat Eeyore's head. I could never forget you, Eeyore. Not in a million years. Eeyore sighed. Well, I suppose it's nice to be remembered, even if it is only for a little while. Christopher chuckled softly. It's more than just a little while, Eeyore. I'm back, and we're going to have all sorts of adventures, just like we used to. And so, with all of his friends by his side, Christopher Robin wandered through the 100-acre wood, the memories of his childhood flooding back with every step. It felt as though no time had passed at all. He was home again, in the place where imagination ruled, and where doing nothing often led to the very best something. The sun began to dip behind the trees, casting a golden glow over the woods, but Christopher knew that this was only the beginning. The 100-acre wood had always been a part of him, and now, with his friends by his side, it would be a part of him forever. And as they laughed and talked, the joy of being together filled the forest, making it come alive with the magic of friendship.